Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Lauren Noble, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Buckley Institute. I'm delighted to welcome all of you. I'm delighted to welcome all of you here for our reunion weekend event. Before I introduce our guests for today, I want to say a few brief words about the Buckley Institute. The Buckley Institute is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and freedom of speech at Yale. We host lectures, seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 780 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley Institute has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political discourse. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about us on our website, buckleyinstitute.com. This morning, we're thrilled to be hosting a discussion on free speech at Yale and beyond. We've assembled a terrific panel to explore this important and timely topic. David Bromwich is Sterling Professor of English at Yale University and a Professor Adjunct of Law at Yale Law School. A cultural critic and literary scholar, Bromwich has written and edited a number of volumes which span the fields of romanticism, modern poetry, moral philosophy, and political writing. He began his career at Princeton University, where he was named Mellon Professor of English. Bromwich has been teaching at Yale since 1988. From 1991 to 1994, he served as director of Yale University's Whitney Humanities Center. Bromwich's titles include How Words Make Things Happen, The Intellectual Life of Edmund Burke, and Moral Imagination. Bromwich's first book, Hazlitt, The Mind of a Critic, was named a 1984 National Book Critics Circle finalist in criticism. Bromwich has edited critical editions that include On Empire, Liberty, and Reform, Speeches and Letters of Edmund Burke, and most recently, Writing Politics, an anthology. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Next to Professor Bromwich, we have Dr. Sally Satel. Dr. Sally Satel is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a practicing psychiatrist, and a lecturer at Yale University School of Medicine. She examines mental health policy as well as political trends in medicine. Her publications include PCMD, How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine, The Health Disparities Myth, When Altruism Isn't Enough, The Case for Compensating Organ Donors, and One Nation Under Therapy, co-authored with Christina Hoff Sommers. Her book, Brainwashed, The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience with Scott Lilienfeld, was a 2014 finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Science. And next to Dr. Satel, we have Professor Noël Vallis. Professor Vallis is professor of Spanish at Yale University. She has written on the literature, culture, and history of modern Spain, the Spanish Civil War, religion and literature, and the study of celebrity and cultural icons. Her work in women's and gender studies was recognized with the Victoria Urbano Academic Achievement Prize. A corresponding member of the Royal Spanish Academy and a past member of the NEH's National Council on the Humanities, she is also a recipient of Fulbright, Guggenheim, and NEH National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowships. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Satel, Professor Vallis, and Professor Bromwich. And so the way our format will work today is we'll start with some questions from me just to get the conversation started, but we definitely want to have plenty of time for your questions, so please do be thinking about what questions you want to ask the panel, and when we get to audience Q&A, we'll come around with a mic to call on you. So to start things off, my first question for the panel is this. The three of you are signatories on a new Faculty for Yale initiative, which describes itself as a group of faculty from across the university interested in helping Yale revitalize its fundamental mission to preserve, produce, and transmit knowledge. The Faculty for Yale website addresses, among other important topics, the free speech principles of the Woodward Report, institutional neutrality, viewpoint diversity, the role of the faculty, and transparency. I recognize that none of you speak on behalf of the group, but I wanted to start by asking each of you why you signed, which issues resonated with you the most, and why.
Oh, shall I start? Or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Is this working? Yes. Okay, great. Thank you so much for this invitation to talk with you, and thank you for being here and for the lovely introductions. I would say all of the above. All of the issues that you mentioned, Lauren, are of great interest to me and of concern. It would be hard to say one over the other, but perhaps, I guess, the most overriding issue is academic freedom, freedom of expression. And this, in part, goes back to, it's a long-standing concern of mine, but it also goes back in part to an experience that I had, indeed, with the Buckley Institute when it was called the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. And it was at one of the annual conferences, and I was moderating a panel. And it was a very interesting experience that I had when this happened. Just a day or two before that, and this was in 2015, Professor Nicholas Christakis had been surrounded and harassed by Yale undergraduates. You may remember that incident that arose out of Halloween costumes, if it is to be believed. Well, Professor Christakis was also participating in this panel that I was moderating, and the theme of the conference was exactly on in defense of academic freedom. So I do not remember the exact commentary that I believe it was Professor Christakis said during this panel, but whatever it was, it provoked a response from some Yale undergraduates who began to bang on the doors and yell and scream and basically try to disrupt a panel which was ironically on academic freedom, freedom of speech. And so this has resonated with me since then. And it is certainly one of the things that I keep in mind because it is not an isolated incident. These are the kinds of things that are happening across the country, and they're still happening here as well.
Excuse me. Hi, thank you also for the invitation. I think of all of that litany of reasons why that statement exists. The one that resonated with me the most, I think, is the idea of social justice ideology intruding into, in my case, actually medicine. It may sound a little, I was just telling Professor Vallis, some of the examples I can give you almost sound like parodies or exaggerations, but they're not. Medicine is this book I wrote that you mentioned, PCMD, How Political Correctness is Corrupting Medicine, that book is 25 years old. And I'm thinking of revisiting it, not as necessarily an update, but as an entirely new volume, because at the time it was a movement that was biting around kind of the fringes of medicine, but now it is just intruded in earnest, so, to the extent that if you were to read statements by the AMA and the Association for American Medical Colleges and statements by the American Psychiatric Association and so on, you would believe that they see, now we are supposed to envision medicine as a vehicle for social justice. patient care is in there, but it's not the top priority. And that doctors really are to see themselves as activists first, and again, healers second. And this is an obsession that has infiltrated almost every level. Can I just give one little example? This is it happens to be in biophysics, but I just read this the other day, and it takes place at Yale. This was an article. It says, want to be a molecular biologist at Yale? In which case you have to, of course, endorse DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And specifically, this is actually true in medicine. I had to, when I re-upped for my lectureship, I had to say what I did to advance DEI. And, I left it blank, and I'm still alive. But so if you do not endorse any of the following, your promotion is significantly endangered, or your hiring. If you say you have no knowledge or awareness of DEI, if you do not feel personal responsibility for helping to create an inclusive environment, okay, that's a little rough. But if you have no goals for it, if you have, as I said, if you don't have a strong interest in it, if you don't have a sustained track record of, again, helping DEI issues, if you don't have a clear and detailed plan for it, this is not the job. And I suppose I'll just sum up by saying, because I know I will get into some of the more harrowing examples that I've encountered later, including my near cancellation experience, is that it's so important, especially when you're working with patients, not to let your politics intrude on what you do, and that really energizes me. So that's why I signed it.
Noel mentioned the events of 2015-16, the push for changing the name of Calhoun College, and the candlelight vigil held at the president's house, and what was less publicized, but I think not kept secret, a faculty town hall where the pressure was so strong for change that there was no doubt our current president of the university would change his view and commitment and decide that Calhoun had to be renamed. That was done through a committee and so on. I need to add that John C. Calhoun is no kind of hero for me, and that I was not even averse to seeing the name hyphenated or a whole historical rotunda put in to show why Calhoun was something special among Yale colleges. But the way it was done and the kind of mob mentality, mobs come in all kinds, including intellectual ones, that made for the pressure of that change, I revolted against. I did not sign a petition that was going around faculty, ended up, I think, having something like 300 signatories for the change, and it included language about Yale having always been a systemically racist institution and still being that. And I never sign petitions. I try to sign as few as possible, but I'm not an absolute resistor. And would only do so if I agree with every word that I'm signing on to. So I didn't sign that one, but I liked the mission statement of Faculty for Yale. Did not find that I disagreed with any word, and signed it to be literal about your question for that reason. I would mention that the amount of administrative apparatus that has been built up at Yale, and Yale is not unique, this is the rule in universities nationwide now, administrative apparatus that has no exactly educational reason for being, as we would formerly have defined education. That's been noticeable and to me, something to regret. You saw it in the Title IX apparatus coming before what is now DEI. So transparency about that, who are these administrators, what are their powers, authorities, and so on. That seems to me worth asking for faculty who consider themselves part of the governing of a university, and this too, the Faculty for Yale statement incorporated. Finally, a little anecdote. One of the brighter students I taught over the last decade told me, this would have been about 6 years ago, that when I was asking him about, well, how I forget how he got onto it, but you feel pretty open to talk to people about your views. And this was a, I don't know, moderate student, very intelligent, maybe a little tending toward conservative, and he said, no, speech was much freer in my high school than it is at Yale. And this was startling, because for me, I'm from the late 60s, early 70s, from California. And I went to Yale, and college was a great liberation. I mean, I felt you could say anything, actually. And there was no sense of people listening and about to report you and saying the wrong thing. So, and whereas high school had not been quite like that. So I think we should try to move back towards where college feels like an even freer place than high school.
Good luck.
Well, that comment goes perfectly into my next question that I had for the panel, which is, obviously, one of the big reasons we're having this discussion is to talk about freedom of speech on campus. There are a lot of different ways to look at this question from a student perspective and from a faculty perspective, and both of those in regards to the source of the greatest, pressure to self-censor. For students, that could be future employers, their professors, the administration, and most significantly, their peers. Buckley's survey of Yale undergraduates last year found that 43% report self-censoring somewhat or very often. 46% say they don't feel comfortable expressing disagreement with professors about controversial topics in written assignments. I wanted to ask our panel, what do you observe in the classroom and on campus on this front, and how has that changed throughout your time at Yale?
Are we going in the same order? Okay.
But we can reverse order if you want. We can keep
Okay,
going
that
back
would
and
be
forth. I don't think many students want directly to challenge their professor and argue face-to-face with them in a confrontational way. That has never been the case. But something about the general ethos of conformity around good opinions, I think probably discourages students more from doing that now than any previous time in my life anyway. But what contributes more to that suppression of the desire to speak controversially or provocatively or to just inquire in some forbidden area, I think has been the presence of social media. That isn't, you can't lay the blame for that on any single party or any single person. It's a piece of technology that has become part of our social mores that has had enormous effects on American society at large, and I think its hidden and visible effects on education are substantial. The kind of repression that I think needs to be guarded against, and guarded against by some group watching out for such things like the Buckley Institute, like the FFY, though they are not connected, these two things. That seems to me important just for keeping the sense students have that they're not going to be punished for any one thing they say that's wrong. As for teachers enforcing doctrinal obedience, I haven't heard any terrible stories about that happening at Yale, and I think that's something that one should have explicitly in the rules. subject to reprimand by an academic authority within the university. That is, if there's a teacher who does not permit political opinions or social opinions or medical opinions that are within the subject matter of the course to be expressed, and to be expressed in a non-riotous way, but politely and argumentatively. If there's a teacher who stops that kind of discussion, or can be seen to retaliate against students who hold the wrong opinions by giving low grades, that should be subject to scrutiny. But I don't know any terrible stories about that. On the other hand, the scene of sort of generally things being all of one good doctrine is such that it's not impossible that tendency would develop.
My experience has been very similar overall. I do think students hesitate to bring up opinions which they might perhaps perceive as not being well received by their peers or by faculty. On the other hand, I would like to give a couple of encouraging stories. It's anecdotal, but I was teaching a class this past semester to first years. I had two classes, both of them for first years, which was delightful. And one of them was in Spanish and the other one was in DS, because I also teach in the directed studies program outside of my department. And in the course, the Spanish course, we were discussing a work in which the theme of religion was extremely important. I had a TF for this course, a lovely TF. She was from China, and she asked me, can we discuss these issues? This was not in class, but outside of class. Can we discuss such an issue as religion in the class? I said, well, if we don't talk about religion with respect to this particular novel, we would be derelict in our responsibilities, because it is part of the material. And what was so interesting was how interested the students were in discussing the issue. We left it completely open to how they would like to look at it, and it was one of the best discussions we had in the class. In DS, also, again, for first years, directed studies, we teach, it is the version of the Great Books that Yale has, Great Books program, and it's a wonderful program. And here, too, perhaps in part because they're first years, but also I think because of the nature of the program, that there was a sense of freer discussion of people not feeling that they needed to censor themselves as much perhaps as in other classes. So there are some bright spots. I think we need to be encouraging these things, obviously.
I wish I were encouraging. But that is one of, you really tap into one of the biggest questions I've always had, which is, how big or small is what you think is a silent majority here? I certainly know that, again, back in medicine, and this extends to all medical schools, certainly not Yale, or at least the major ones, is that a lot of students are quite quiet, and certainly a vocal minority holds sway. And there are a number of consequences, of course, but actually, because the vocal fill-in-the-blank majority or minority holds sway, they've actually caused professors to self-censor. I've seen a lot of that in medicine now. There's a culture that's well over 100 years old, where doctors, when you're on rounds, you quiz. There's a different name for it. It's called pimping, but that's what they call it. And basically, you're around the patient's bedside, or you're in an operating room or whatever, and the doctor just asks questions. The professor just asks questions. What's this artery? How would you treat this? What are the side effects of this antibiotic? I mean, on and on and on. You cannot do that anymore, because if a person doesn't know the answer, they feel unsafe. They feel attacked. This is just frankly incredible. It's just, in many ways, that some of the most important traditions are being overturned. I know a lot of, this does always sound just painfully anecdotal, but when anecdotes are just so widespread, they really coalesce into a significant pattern. Another is that so many physicians, against more senior people, do feel I hate to say this word, almost endangered when they deal with certain students, that they've, to the extent that they have discretionary teaching responsibilities. You can teach, or you can spend more time doing administration, or you can work in the lab more, or something like that. They're saying, no thanks. I don't want to have contact with students, because you can just step on a rhetorical landmine, and it can be uncomfortable at worst, and you can endanger your career at most. Just two more examples. A physician at the University of Pittsburgh wrote a paper, a very well-considered paper, on affirmative action in cardiology, which is a little different than affirmative action in medicine, because he's really focusing on the subspecialty. And he used data, and basically, you can imagine his argument. I mean, this was written in the most neutral academic terms, but he clearly came down on the side of this is not a good practice for the subspecialties in particular. And this is a man who, I looked him up afterwards, he has spectacular ratings. He's an incredible teacher. He's an electrophysiologist, a cardiac electrophysiologist, which is it's kind of the quantum physics of medicine. It's very, very difficult, very challenging, and he was regarded as a fantastic teacher. So what happened? Of course, his article was retracted without really any justification. He lost his leadership of the fellowship, of the electrophysiology fellowship. He couldn't have contact with medical students. Horror story. Maybe I'll just stop with that horror story. But unfortunately, I do think medicine, sorry, I don't know why I did that, is one of the, you do hear optimistic stories coming out, poking out little green shoots of optimism about maybe woke has peaked. It hasn't peaked in this arena.
I don't see that it's peaked either. Just one
No.
little anecdote
I wouldn't say
as
that
to whether there's a silent majority or minority. I don't know. And students who take my classes, because I teach older literature, would tend to be students who, educationally anyway, have traditional tastes. That doesn't graph onto politics, but I probably don't see the most active, energetic, and enforcing of the younger crowd in my classes. But just an example, in a course called Shakespeare's Political Plays that I taught last semester, one student got into a riff about violent scenes in 2 or 3 of the tragedies we'd been reading, and he got into it a little intensely and with picturesque language, and when he stopped, I said, I'm glad that was it, because I was beginning to feel unsafe. And as there is laughter in this room, there was laughter in the class.
Okay.
So, they're aware of this, but I think lots of teachers play along with it. And this utter self-enforced humorlessness is the real enemy as far as I'm concerned. And, what you do to break it up, I think students are capable of breaking it up within a class even that's taught with a more careful canopy of opinion over it than mine tend to be. But I don't, students should be willing to do that. A few should be willing to do that. I see far fewer students of a sort of experimental, anarchic temperament than was the case, say, 25 years ago. But that has everything to do with the way colleges like this one select their students. Yes. They have been good boys and girls all the way along to a more and more restrictive degree. So they're not the type who are going to break things up by saying something unexpected.
So I also want to ask the panel about the faculty. Two of you have tenure, but that doesn't necessarily make you entirely immune from the pressure to conform. How monolithic or intellectually diverse do each of you think that your respective fields are? Are there cases where there's pressure, implicit or explicit, to take certain positions or avoid criticizing certain ideas? And where do those pressures come from, usually?
Well, I work in Hispanic studies, and this is a field that has been increasingly like other fields in the humanities. But I can only speak about my own field with absolute certainty on this topic. has been moving more and more toward the idea that everything should revolve around social justice in some way or another. My view is that almost anything can be discussed, can be written about. There's really practically no topic that I would say is taboo. We should be open to discussing anything, right? The problem that I have with this is that with this kind of almost obsessive insistence on focusing research and teaching as well on only one area, a lot of other things are not being talked about. And that strikes me as impoverishing academically and intellectually. I can give you an example, and this is a very recent example. I published a book a couple of years ago on the great Spanish poet, playwright Federico Garcia Lorca, who was assassinated at the start of the Spanish Civil War in 1936. And the book was published by Yale University Press. There were two anonymous evaluations, reader reports, which is what is typical of the process of going through publication with a university press. And in one of them, the anonymous reviewer, he or she, said he was very concerned that I had spent so much time talking about the reaction of the right to Lorca's death and works. And that he was afraid that I would be criticized for that in book reviews afterward. I was actually very taken aback by that. I thought, my goodness, are we so afraid to deal with topics like this that we're suggesting then that he was basically suggesting on the one hand that I suppress some of this information, that I cut some of this information, I think at the very least. And then he also said, and she should also be talking about the reaction of the left. Well, I did, but not as much because it has been done ad nauseum. Lorca was a man of the left, and so you would expect that there would be a lot of reaction to it, particularly to his murder. So I did not make any changes in that regard. And Yale University Press did not ask me to do anything with it. They didn't ask me to take anything out or change it. And it was published the way I wanted to see it, for good or for ill. In one of the published book reviews, which was very interesting, the reviewer brought this issue up. He said, in Hispanic studies, it is anathema, that's the word that he used, to speak about certain kinds of ideas and ideologies. And he did this, though, in a way for which I was very grateful, that was open-ended. In other words, he said, why shouldn't we? But I think this is a good example of how pressure can be exerted. And we have to resist it to the extent we can. I have tenure, as Lauren has pointed out, but nonetheless, you can feel this even if you have a tenured position.
I guess, yeah, the tendencies in my field that I regret the advance of aren't particularly to do with politics stated as such or anything you might call activism, but the move towards teaching in a department of English, in departments of literature, phenomena, texts, whatever, that are not literature. So in English departments in general, I won't single out the Yale English department, you find a great deal of work being done on race, on gender, yes, on media studies, film, TV, etc. And above all, I would say a contemporary emphasis, moving towards the 20th and 21st century. A recently tenured member of this Yale history department told me it should really be called the Department of 20th Century Studies. They had, and this is the history department here, they had two British historians, Steve Pincus and Keith Wrightson, both very distinguished, doing different aspects of British history. As of, 6 years ago, they now have none and there is no, of British history, and there's no move towards appointing anyone in British history. So there you see, even more pronounced than in English departments, a tendency toward the contemporary, towards the, I don't know how to put it, the miscellaneous. And I think, going back to what Noël said about directed studies, the distinguishing feature of which is that you have a common curriculum, so that students coming out of that program have points of reference that they can speak to each other about with some learning, with some sense of that there's a map of history of ideas and literature and so on. Where a subject matter has become so miscellaneous, and where even the medium you're held answerable for is unclear, I think there's a danger of sort of disintegration from within for reasons that aren't exactly political, though it does tend to conform to the, to the current trends in good thinking politics. So, I mean, I don't know what's to be done about that. It's not, you're not punished for doing the earlier periods, but fewer and fewer appointments are made in the earlier periods.
Dr. Satel?
Oh, I'm not tenured.
Well, but do you want to talk about can you talk about that then, the faculty pressure to conform?
Oh, well, yes, that's what I was, I guess, just alluding to earlier, well, I had mentioned earlier I had a near cancellation experience, and I won't go into all the sordid details, except to say it started with the title of a talk that I'd given. I know this is basically Grand Rounds, which is a weekly large meeting for that I think every department in medicine has. So this was the psychiatry Grand Rounds, and I had just come back from a year in Appalachia. I was helping with some clinical work and studying what used to be called the opioid epidemic, but now it involves so many other drugs. So the title of my talk was My Year Abroad, Ironton, Ohio, and the Opioid Crisis. So, either you appreciate irony or you don't, but that was the beginning of the end. I mean, they found that othering, that's their words. I've never used other as a verb in my life, but, and...
This is the first time, beware.
And dehumanizing, and anyway, I think that was related to I showed photos, of course, of a depressed place in southern Ohio. I didn't have any pictures of people looking in distress. They were all, anyway, so there were other things that they managed to find offensive, like my discussion of agency and drug addiction. And so by the end of it, there were some hostile, kind of nasty questions towards the end. This was on Zoom. I could feel icy blasts coming from the computer. I just knew they didn't like it. And the questions, I'm offended, and it was just not pleasant, and I hope I handled it well. But my point is, I expected to get emails like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they said that, and it was so rude, and it was a good talk, or whatever. Nothing, just nothing. And it was an email. It wouldn't even have been a public, any kind of thing where they would stand up in the audience and say, well, I think you made some good points. So, yeah, there is this chill that just settles over a lot. And it's a real suppressive atmosphere.
So I now want to turn to some audience questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand, and Isabel is coming around with the mic, so just wait for the mic to get to you.
Who is the they in that instance? Was it students?
Oh, I apologize. It was both, actually. It was residents and the faculty. Yeah. But again, it was three questions. They were all, negative to, one was kind of hostile. But then a month later, I got a letter saying that they wanted to take my appointment away because of this. And the letter was, frankly, almost a parody of these kinds of things. I gave the talk on January 8th, 2021. That means 48 hours after the Capitol was, so I re-traumatized them. They used that phrase. I had re-traumatized them after.
The second trauma is worse than the first.
Yes, you get a sensitization phenomenon. And
The letter wanting to
Well, they never signed their name, but it was called Concerned Residents of Yale. So it could have been, yeah, it could have been 3 people, it could have been, 40,
don't
who the hell
know.
knows?
It was an anonymous group without any authority.
Well, they had enough authority to, they made the chairman pretty anxious, and he, bless him, he ultimately didn't act on it, but that incident had a long tail. I mean, the reason, you invited me here today, so yesterday I was going to do, I live in DC, so I'd love to be up here more, but anyway, long story short, I was supposed to do it after so many years of not being up here because of COVID, and then I spent that year abroad, and then I offended everyone, so they couldn't possibly have me back, in 2023 or 22, and I thought now is safe, and I was going to do a journal club on an article, a completely neutral article that was published in the Lancet about the opioid, nobody's year abroad, and they said, too soon. Can you believe that?
Why too soon?
Because some of the students are still, they haven't graduated yet.
They're troubled.
Oh, for God's sake.
Sorry. And I love the department. I graduated from that department. It was outstanding. Anyway.
I was shocked and saddened about a year ago to read in the alumni magazine of Yale Medical School that they had appointed a dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I felt that not only is this an example of administrative bloat at the school, but that it suggests an umbrella of political correctness over a community and a group of students who are the finest students in the world and in their mid-20s, mature and highly accomplished. And since then, as a contributor to the medical school, I've been giving them $1 every time they ask for money, and hoping that I would stir the giant and they would talk to me about my contributions. It hasn't happened. But do we still have in our medical school a dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
It's worse in the sense every department has its own DEI person. And they, at least I know in the one I'm in, that they do exert quite a bit of influence. And I remember once they were giving a lecture on microaggressions. I mean, it's a legitimate social phenomenon to discuss, and they posted and they handed out readings, which they almost never do, or they posted the readings they handed out, and I noticed that they were missing, what was without doubt the most rigorous, the most, thoughtful article on microaggressions, and especially in doing research on microaggressions, because in some ways, what can you say about it? It's how someone, it's a subjective response. And as we all know, intent doesn't matter. So I communicated with this DEI sub-dean, and I said, you have to have Scott Lilienfeld's 80-page article in psychological science. It's a masterpiece. I mean, it is regarded as the ultimate exploration of this, especially on a level of if someone wants to investigate it. And she of course said no. And then I asked the the guy who ran the residency program, who I knew from when I was here. I said, Bob, you've got to, come on, this is just an indispensable, article. And he refused, and I feel bad, I'm giving you all these horrible examples, but he was the one who wrote an email to everyone several years ago, ecstatic that in the incoming class of residents there were no white men. So,
Does everybody know what a microaggression is? You sure you know?
I'm so sorry.
Let me give it. I mean, the standard. So
Thanks for
intent
asking.
doesn't matter. It is. It's a real phenomenon, as Sally said. But it is one that, in earlier times, would have been negotiated through personal back and forth and a recognition that you'd made somebody feel awkward unnecessarily, and this was a pattern you probably had of making such people feel awkward that
Yeah,
you
just asking
that you
someone
could
where
stop.
they're from, those kind of things.
Oh, well, the standard example given is a white young woman, undergraduate, let's say,
Her name is Karen?
comes up to a black young woman, undergraduate, who has, wiry hair of a black person, and says, "Oh, can I touch your hair?" Now, there's nothing malicious about that, nothing other than in a somewhat adventurous, somewhat conventional way, trying to be friendly but from a distance. But if you're the black young woman, you have experienced this 100 times, and it is boring. So you might want to tell her, you can, but I get a lot of these requests, and it's really, you see it. What you see is probably what you can imagine it feels like. Or you have such a beautiful accent. Where are you from? Right. That's another classic example. So that others the person. She started it. I didn't do it. You've made the person feel a little bit alien. And again, that's something to learn as a matter of everyday civilian etiquette. Don't do that in your very first encounter with someone in the first 30 seconds before you know anything about them. Do they have a sense of humor? But when you know somebody pretty well, I've always wondered, blah, blah, blah. So these are things that can easily be taught, but the idea that you could possibly be called into a sub-dean's office or college dean's office for having, committed 3 or 4 microaggressions, which 2 students separately reported, it's just silly. It's paternalistic, and that's what we've gotten into, making. My wife, who's a psychotherapist, said not that recently, 10, 15 years ago, it's as if they're trying to make a world where there's no such thing as a bad experience. No such thing as a bad experience, however small, which you can laugh off in retrospect. So, that I don't hold any political movement responsible for that. That has to do with the therapeutic and paternal stance of the universities, which they've taken on their own. It's part of what you pay for, and it's terribly misspent money. It's a larger phenomenon, but that's what a microaggression is.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning. And my question is about academic freedom, and in particular, the limits of academic freedom. And I want to use the example of the October 7th attack on Israel. Is there a limit to academic freedom in relation to what faculty members say in response? For example, if there are faculty members who glorify the attack and support future attack on Israeli civilians, does that fall within academic freedom? And if the answer to that is yes, what is the proper response in the panelist view from the university? Is it neutrality, or is it a statement of condemnation or disagreement or otherwise with those faculty members?
Well, let me give an example from Columbia, which is, has had a more prominent and louder and more remarkable manifestation of responses to October 7th, and then the more recent student protest. Columbia, if you haven't followed it, something on the pattern of Yale, but about 3 times the size. They occupied the center of campus. The president of the university brought in police early to clear them out, and then brought in police a second time to clear out the building they had occupied. There is a professor there, Joseph Massad, who's in Mideastern Studies. It's a very political department, pro-Palestinian Mideastern Studies department at Columbia. And he wrote I'm giving you facts which weren't even in the, apparently in the possession of that congressional committee that gave the president of Columbia such an unholy grilling. He wrote an article in a online outlet called Electronic Intifada, really praising the October 7th attack in aesthetic terms as astounding, astonishing, stunning, and as the first major act of resistance that would lead to more. There's nothing in my understanding of academic freedom or in the First Amendment that prevents him from saying that or that should lead him to lose his tenure. But an officer of the university, speaking as a person, should be free to say that's a terrible thing. Preferably not the president, but other people in the university saying it. He was also at the time the head of their Humanities Review Committee. He had rotated into that position. And that's where the president of Columbia, that new president, what's her name, Minouche Shafik, kind of buckled a pretty bad defeat for intellectual and academic freedom under pressure of questioning, where the Congresswoman Elise Stefanik said, "Will you fire him?" And she said, "Yes, we don't do that." The correct answer, the libertarian answer, would have been to say, I personally disapprove of what he has said. He is a head of an important committee, and he may be under reasonable suspicion of being biased on these questions. So we are investigating him according to a university process. We, Congresswoman, have our processes too. I assume that you would not personally fire a member of Congress because you think that person made a bad statement. You have a process, don't you? So that's one of the ways academic freedom works. There's a good book on this subject by Howard Gilman and Erwin Chemerinsky called Free Speech on Campus, published by Yale Press around 7 years ago. And I recommend that if you want to look at it. But there are different standards for private and public institutions. Public institutions are governed necessarily by the First Amendment. That is, you can say anything. Private institutions can have their own rules, but the Woodward Report is a very good outline of the rules for Yale, and this may get us into a different area, so I don't want to go on too long. But with regard to October 7th, a single person can say anything he or she wants, student, faculty, whatever, however repulsive, however heartless, as many statements after October 7th were. And you can say anything about what Israel has been doing to Gaza. You can say anything about that you want, no matter how heartless. But the university as an institution taking a stand, Yale University says this about that, this is something new and it is silly. Yale University, the School of Management, actually had a pro-Ukraine rally towards the beginning of that war with a Ukrainian flag up at the center, and the former and present president of Yale were at that rally, as well as the head of SOM. I don't think Yale University has had a rally for America in the Second World War. So what is this thing about institutional statements, hand on heart, and the whole institution goes with it? I don't even have words for it, but that's a new development, and I think it's wrong, but there aren't any rules against it.
Yeah, I would like to add that, particularly with regard to what has happened after October 7th on campuses across the country, yes, like David, I would say that you could make those kinds of statements. Anti-Semitic statements are morally reprehensible. It's when students or faculty or other members of the community, of the academic community, begin to harass and intimidate, preventing people from crossing, from one point of the campus to another, unless you agree with their stance, and apparently that did happen here at one point. There, it seems to me that they are crossing the line, and the administration, the university administration, should take a strong stance against such behavior, which strikes me as antithetical to the mission of the university.
So that's an old distinction between persuasion and force, and something a little bit mediating between the two, or not quite halfway between, more on the side of force, is coercion. Yeah. And you saw something close to bodily and certainly opinion coercion in these campus protests on Palestine. Much more, again, at Columbia, much more at NYU than at Yale, but they did happen, and that shouldn't be allowed. Mm-hmm. I give this example about, genocide, because that came up in the congressional hearing. And there's a great difference between one, say, pro-Palestinian man in a screaming argument with a Jewish woman, undergraduate, saying, well, maybe you deserve genocide, right? We know a word for what that man was at that moment. But that one person getting into a screaming argument and saying that, there's nothing to be done about it. And there never was, except extreme disapproval. If that person does that sort of thing a lot of the time, he should be shunned by decent people, period. But if you have 6 such men at twilight following one woman and saying, genocide, 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 that's different. That's different. That's menace, that's intimidation, and the university can do something about that. And, it takes a great deal of common sense, it should be, to make these distinctions, and neither universities nor people in Congress have been very bright about that.
Yeah, I think there's been something of a lack of character. It's an old-fashioned concept, having just a bit of character, a bit of spine in reacting to some of the events here and elsewhere in the last several weeks.
I've been given the mic back here. A quick question. We have a looking for a new president of Yale. Can you give us any information on whether free speech is one of the considerations, or where we stand on that?
Where we stand on free speech.
Or I guess any comments on the Yale presidential search and what's being prioritized in the search? The question was, is free speech a consideration in that?
That's a good question. I have no idea.
Is the faculty consulted on these matters?
No. It should be a consideration. Whether it's
Yes.
being put forward very strongly, I don't know. And I think they're going to find it's hard to get good people wanting to be a university president anywhere these days. So the delay is not surprising, but it's unfortunate.
One quick statement reflecting what you were talking about, a neutrality by the university, which I personally agree with. In 1956, when some of us in this room, including me, were on the Yale campus, there was a strong protest on the Russian invasion of Hungary. The second thing is, I'm wondering whether the fact that the Buckley fellows now number almost 10% of the undergraduates of Yale, whether that had anything to do with the relatively moderate protests that took place on the Yale campus. But my question of you all is, how would you explain how or the rise of wokeism? Is it internal? Did it come in the academic community? Did it come from outside agitators? Or can we ignore the 800-pound gorilla, which is further regulation and incursion into the educational process by the federal government?
I wrote a book about this published in 1992 called Politics by Other Means, Higher Education and Group Thinking. I thought then, in the early 90s, late 80s, that this was coming in the academy, but I thought I didn't know how fast it would go. So to the first part of your question, yes, it has come from the academy, but it is spread down through K through 12 teaching, through education in general, and into the culture at large, the culture of the media, of the center left that pretty much is the prevailing, what I now call polite culture in the country. So that's just there. That's a fact. That is a conformism as strong as the one that I grew up with, which was, anti-communist. This is the greatest country in the world. A very uninspiring culture in my view. But what we have now is even more, though perhaps more. Tacitly dogmatic, and I don't know what's to be done about it except to encourage people who know how to resist it from inside. That is to say, you see a bright young scholar, try to get that person tenured or get that person encouraged, and be personally encouraging to students and other people who think for themselves. There's no, it's not dangerous to think for yourself. It just takes a bit more initiative because this canopy of opinion is bigger and more overarching than it used to be. The DEI, what we're calling diversity, equity, inclusion, and the institution of putting in deans of such enforcement and the like at universities, at medical schools, at professional schools, that's new. That's the bureaucratization of a certain social attitude.
By the government?
Well, the government isn't forcing universities to do this, but it's being done in government too. Of course, so you have it's throughout that throughout our culture and society now. The best defense against it, I think, is a legitimate demand for transparency. Who are the people who have these positions? What are their authorities? What are their powers? Let's talk about it. And I think that there is that much openness in American society for sure. So people need to know more about it. If I say DEI, I might think I know what I mean, but I really don't. And none of the people who are suspicious of it, and the drumbeat, let's stop DEI, and most of the people who are in favor of it don't know exactly what it amounts to. But my sense would be, think of what the institution is supposed to be dedicated to. And one way of defining the problem is, it seems to me that these concerns with diversity for its own sake and so on, grouped ethnic, racial, gender, whatever, diversity. We're not talking about differences of opinion. It's a non-educational element of education. Questions can be asked about that. And the same would be for law firms that have a DEI officer. Does this person have legal training? Usually not. So, what's the job we're doing? How does this relate to that? Does attention, as Sally was saying, to DEI concerns help you to be a better brain surgeon? So, if the country wants not to de-intellectualize itself completely, these questions have to be asked, but not in an agitational way that it is as uninformed about it as many of the people halfway inside.
Yeah, I was going to say that I can imagine in at least some departments I know, that there is a culture, and there are key people who establish it and enforce it. And frankly, if someone else was just hired, for example, they wouldn't put value, or at least disproportionate value, on the fact that applicants to their department, I've heard about this in psychology, again, I know it's true in my department, that activism, an interest in activism is considered as important as your MCAT scores and your undergraduate scores. It is irrelevant, and that's one of the, in some odd way, the issue in medicine, there's a clarity to it that I don't think exists that cleanly in others, which is to say, what's in the best interest of patients. And a question you guys were talking about earlier, about protesting, or what kind of behaviors can be acceptable on campus. I believe this was NYU, but not here. But after September 11th, a bunch of doctors, medical trainees, and probably I'm saying junior doctors because you don't usually see senior people doing this, were out protesting for Palestine. And you have to think, what if a patient saw you doing that? To me, that's a threshold question for all kinds of things that physicians do in their coats. They can protest for Palestine. I condemn it, but they can do that in their spare time. But they were doing it in the context of their profession. That's outrageous.
Yeah, there's something else that feeds into, I think, what David says, and also Sally. There's this idea that there's no excellence without diversity. This is a phrase that I've seen in a couple of places, and I think it's an idea that's embedded now in academic communities and non-academic communities as well. But what does that mean? I'll be darned if I really understand what the connection is between diversity, and what they mean here is diversity ethnically and racially. It is almost exclusively that, and the connection to excellence. You know, some of the criticism of the Faculty for Yale initiative has come from people who say that somehow we are attacking the idea that we should make sure that we have enough students who come from diverse backgrounds who are attending Yale. It's a ridiculous criticism, because it has nothing to do with that, first of all. All of us encourage the most talented people, whatever their background is, that they'd be able to come to a place like Yale. I mean, I wish I had been able to come to a place like Yale when I was an undergraduate, but at that time, no women were admitted. So I didn't have that opportunity. But so this goes back to this question of enormous conformism. The irony of using this term diversity is that it is not diverse. It's cosmetic, for one thing, the notion of diversity. It is a form of conformism, which I think is far worse than what we saw in the 1950s. These DEI statements, for example, that are required in various universities, or in that department of biophysics here at Yale, are forms of conformism that are actually worse than the loyalty oaths that were required in the 1950s.
Very, you know. So I was going to say, David, you finished?
Yeah.
There's a very good and courageous short article, long column, by the Harvard law professor Randall Kennedy, who is black, against mandatory diversity statements. I think it appeared in the online magazine called Persuasion, and I recommend it to anyone here who wants to look it up. That's going to be argued in courts, and mandatory diversity statements in applications for university jobs it's going to lose in courts, because that goes against constitutional provisions. But you know, at Yale, I can tell a mildly happy story about that. The graduate school, for 1 or 2 years, I forget which, I read graduate applications in the first round for my department, had added mandatory diversity statements as part of the application for the Faculty of Arts and Sciences graduate programs. And enough of us objected to it, and we had 1 or 2, people in conversation with the graduate dean, that it did get pulled. It's no longer there in applications to graduate school. The reasoning I made on this subject was not just that it was an imposition, and as I said before, a non-educational device inserting itself into educational matters, but that it prejudiced the applicant's idea of what sort of research you will be rewarded for.
Yeah.
If you're supposed to say how you contribute something of diversity, and as Noël said, it's always racial, ethnic, or divergent sexual diversity.
Right.
Those are the only categories that interest them. If you are being rewarded for telling a good story about diversity by being admitted to a PhD program, it indicates to you that your research might well go along diversity lines as defined in such statements, and that you won't do as well if you don't emphasize that. Well, that completely goes against the idealism of free inquiry on which American education has been based since the time of John Dewey. It is illiberal in every sense, yeah. So I think it will. That's gonna lose. I think mandatory diversity statements have a very uphill battle, and they will not stay. But the larger tendency is around.
So this is the final question. We're running out of time.
Okay, I'm right here. Thank you so much for all of your eye-opening insights. What percentage of the faculty has signed that FA letter, and what has been the reaction from the deans of the different schools, from the administration? What does it look like going forward?
what percentage of the faculty have signed FFY? I know in numbers, the last I looked, it was around 150 or a little more. I don't think that it had many junior faculty signing, so we can't tell how many might have signed on if they weren't feeling a natural timidity about this. But what the reception was by the administration, not hostile, but not warmly friendly. But they're also under the pressure, it's this jittery moment for Yale administration. The corporation stalls and stalls, can't appoint a new president, and it was a bridge moment. So some of that, it's hard to attach any analysis to, but I would say they didn't denounce it, but there is no sense of, this is very close to what we think in many, many ways, and we would encourage more of this. No, not that either.
Lauren?
Yeah.
Same question with respect to the Buckley Institute. What has the university's reaction or response been to any of your initiatives here?
So I mean, we've been around since 2011, and we've never had a problem being able to host our events on campus. I think there's grudging toleration for our efforts whenever we've had speakers who've required a security presence. We've had to pay for the security, and that's been sort of something that's increased in frequency over the past year. I would say there's been more speakers where we've had a concern about something, but yeah, I mean, now it's at the point where almost, actually just over 11% of the undergraduate population are now Buckley fellows.
Between you and the upper level of management at the university?
I mean, when we've had petitions, calling on Yale to reaffirm its commitment to the Woodward Report and some other, topics that are related to some of the concerns we've discussed today, I mean, a lot of that's been met with silence, unfortunately. But to the question that was asked before about the number of faculty who signed, that I had actually written a similar question that I didn't get to, and I had seen this week 154 signatories, and I had looked up. There were 4,497 Yale faculty, 948 of those have tenure. So yeah, but with that, we're already over time, but I just wanted to thank all of you for coming, and please join me in thanking our excellent panelists this morning.